Welcome to the Dead Pixel Society podcast, the photo imaging industry's leading news source. Here's your host, Gary Pageau. The Dead Pixel Society podcast is brought to you by Media Clip, Advertech Printing, and Independent Photo Imagers.
Hello again, and welcome to the Dead Pixel Society podcast. I'm your host, Gary Pageau, and we're joined by a returning guest, Ben Gibson, who's a technology industry consultant with numerous blue chip clients in the past, including GE, IBM, Eastman Kodak, and Logitech. Hi, Ben. How are you today?
I am doing very well. How are you, Gary?
I'm doing great. Now, people may remember Ben from his appearance on the first and so far only panel discussion we had on the Dead Pixel Society podcast about kind of the history of Kodak Digital and what went right and what could have been improved and things like that. And that's probably one of the most listened episodes we had. But Ben is actually here to talk about more of a general business trend or concept, or I'm not sure what you call it, Ben, but it's a way of determining what stage a business is in and where it's most profitable. So first, before we get into that fun stuff, can you do like a 30-second history for the listeners?
Well, sure. And, I guess I would best characterize myself as an engineer, so I worked my way through college fixing bowling machines, got a degree in engineering, and then went to work at GE, working on really geeky stuff, like digital signal processing for submarines. And Kodak hired me to do digital signal processing for imaging, right? Photo CD cameras, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how I migrated there. And I had a great first phase at Kodak, left there in 2010 and went to Logitech and worked on audio. So I then switched from, sonar and radar to imaging to audio, right? Making waves, as I like to say.
Now that's the name for a book. If you do your autobiography, that's the name. Making Waves with Ben Gibson.
That's right, Making Waves. So, but I started to notice, and then I did some consulting with IBM and again Kodak. So I started to notice that I've always been a systems engineer, right? So systems engineer is very much about life cycles, input, output, signal to noise ratio, noise, you amplify and then you dampen and all that kind of stuff. And there's very much a cyclic nature to everything we have, even our own lives. Right. And so I started to say, I started just notice these patterns, and I don't really know how I came up with the name so much, but then you say, in a business, they're started by engineers, and then they're run by marketing, and then they're run by finance, and then they're run by lawyers, the end, right? That's basically, you think about your startup company going, trying to find product market fit, doing very technology focused. And then, once you find that fit, the marketing people come in and just try to massively scale it globally everywhere, right? Right. That one thing. And then, when you run out of customers, and every company runs out of customers at some point, the shareholders still want their money. And then they say, I guess instead of getting the money from the stock growing, we're going to get it from dividends. Right. And then they start managing costs because they can't rely on revenue growth anymore. And then, that leads to eventually, if you don't have revenue growth, you're eventually going to run out of earnings to leverage. And then what happens is all hell breaks loose and you end up in the lawyer phase. And that's when everything gets cleaned up. Right. So almost every business has that life cycle associated with it. So, I called it EMFL because, it's engineering, marketing, finance, lawyers. Right. And, and you can take almost any company and you can analyze it and say, hey, what phase are they in? Right. Is revenue growing? Are they innovating? And, you can sort of figure out where they are and what they're going to do and be very predictive of what. So there's different characteristics, and just as an aside. So one time I was asked to present at a conference with Vint Cerf, who is the Google guru, right? Was in the morning. He was the keynote speaker in the morning talking about innovation at Google. And they had asked me to talk in the afternoon about why innovation fails, right? So why innovation succeeds and why innovation fails. And I was kind of like a little bit offended when I was asked to do that. I said, well, first of all, innovation doesn't really fail. Every company tries to innovate, but innovation looks different depending on where you are in that business life.
Yep.
Right. So, anyways, so I got, you start digging into like, what phase the company's in and who's running the company and all of that kind of stuff. And it starts to create a pretty simple model. Right. So for example,
well, I go back to your speech. Go back to the speech. I want to hear about what Vin said and what you said. Was it like point counterpoint?
Well, we weren't speaking together. It wasn't
Right.
a panel discussion, but
Right.
obviously, Google, and you think this was probably 5 or 6 years ago. So it wasn't the Google that, Alphabet's having their own issues with the
Absolutely.
marketing and finance phase right now. Right. But he was talking a lot about, their playground, right. And how they would try certain things in their playground. In fact, I'm glad you asked that question because there's a really good example of two companies that I have experience with. When I was so Google has this sort of, they throw spaghetti against the wall with very smart people, and they try different things. And an example that they had was Google TV, right? If you remember that product, they got together with Intel, they were going to build a set-top box and put a mouse, keyboard, and camera on everybody's TV, and life was going to be wonderful. And they spent a lot of money. And then they needed somebody to build the mice and keyboards. And of course, Logitech raised their hand and go, "Wow, this would be great, right? We're going to do Logitech, or we're going to do mice and keyboards for Google TV." And but Google was not committed to the workflow yet, right? They were committed to the concept of Google TV. But Logitech, by building a specific mouse and building a specific keyboard, was committed to a certain workflow, right? So what happened in that case was Google did their typical experimentation, and they said, "Hey, this is sort of working, but let's pivot to Chromecast." Right. And because everyone's using their phone anyways, right? So let's pivot to Chromecast, and Logitech sitting there with mice and keyboards. So in other words, they can't pivot, right? So Intel and Google pivot, and Logitech can't pivot, and Logitech sitting here with $100 million loss, and this is a very profitable, successful company that did not need lines of credit and did not need was self-funding, right? So all of a sudden you're left with a $100 million hole, and you have to go
and a bunch of custom-made gear you can't get rid of, right?
Yeah, exactly. The worst time to go to a bank for a line of credit is when you need one, right?
Right. Exactly.
But they've recovered, and Brack and Darrell did an amazing job turning that company around, and they're doing very well now. But it's an example of, here's a company that was sort of in the marketing phase of Logitech, and a company in the engineering phase of Google at the time, and innovation looked very different for those two companies, right? In that one example, right?
Yeah, that's a great example, because it does kind of talk when you see what's happening like in the photo space. There are different people trying to partner up, and it is almost a phase mismatch. Maybe that's a phrase we can catch, right? Where you have some crazy startup who wants to create some sort of printing thing, but they've got to partner with a very traditional printing platform who is probably in the finance phase, right?
Yeah.
They're about kind of maintaining, controlling costs and maintaining production workflow, and and they're just gonna, milk that thing forever. But you got someone coming in who's all jacked up with engineering. They're, well, can you put a gloss on this one corner of this picture? I can just see where that would be a phase mismatch would be a big challenge, I would imagine.
Yeah. Well, and to that point, it is a phase mismatch, but let's look at Indigo, right? Because Indigo, if you compared it to Xerox and other technologies that were doing electrophotography, the one thing that Indigo did was it had the finishing platform that you could just plug and play different finishing modules onto, right? The innovation wasn't the ink or the it was the ability to finish.
How dare you, sir? How dare you?
I know. I might go to chemistry hell for that one, but the reality is, that speaks to different phases of the workflow, right? And
I'm going to get a nasty letter from Indigo HP going, this is wrong. But anyway.
If Indigo thinks they won because of the ink, they need to talk to their finishing department.
Well, no, I'm agreeing. I'm just saying.
I'm sure the finishing engineer lead is probably going, yeah, go,
go.
I tried to tell him that, anyways. But the point is that, every company is on some phase of the life cycle. Right. And companies, an example, some companies have very short lives on a life cycle. If you take a Yahoo or an Instagram or something like that, I mean, they scale massively. They're very popular, but then they can't hold on because TikTok comes along. Right. And the next thing comes along. So tech companies like apps tend to have very short life cycles. We could think back to the time when Yahoo was, talking about Yahoo went from workplace, food and, work-life balance and everything to restricting work life, right? And cutting costs and cutting all that stuff, right? And oftentimes, nobody ever puts in their deck, in their investor deck, we're going to create a really crappy culture. Right. Nobody ever hires an HR person to say that and put that in the investor deck. Right. But
we're going to hire a celebrity CEO who will poison our culture.
But when companies go into the finance phase and they can't grow revenue and they have to start cutting costs and earnings becomes the way they pay their shareholders back, those cultures become toxic. So a great culture turns into a toxic culture. Did somebody build a toxic culture? No, they just ran out of money. Right.
Well, I would say that the customer changed, right? The customer changed from being end users of the product to the shareholders.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Photo retailers, energize your sales with ShareMe Chat, the proven texting platform. Using chat to text on your website keeps your customers connected and buying. See us at Pro and IPI to find out why dealers using ShareMe Chat close more sales without adding staff. Find out more at shareme.chat.
Well, that's right. And by the way, I mean, this kind of, there's another example of like when companies are in the marketing phase and you buy a stock, you make your money when the stock price goes up. If you buy a stock like IBM or a company that's in the finance phase, you're looking at dividends, right? So when you see things like dividends increases or stock buybacks, right? They're trying to use the stock to attract shareholders. But companies in the engineering and marketing phase are using product to attract shareholders. Right.
Exactly.
So you see these patterns sort of like repeating themselves over and over again. You can look at a company and say, well, who's buying their stock? And you can sort of tell, or what, are they talking about? What are they talking about in their press release? Are they talking about revenue growth? If you have a revenue story, every company will tell their revenue story. If you don't have a revenue story, you tell an EBITDA story.
Right. Exactly.
Anyways, if you see a company, I read countless financial, when quarters are reported, and I read them and I look and say, well, what's the PR person leading with? Are they leading with EBITDA? Are they leading with revenue? Right.
Yeah. Well, I think it was interesting. There's a company. I'm not going to say their name, but I suppose I could. But it's a small lighting company. Their big thing was coming with lighting gear, right? And they got really popular with content creators and all that stuff. They're a small public company. And what was interesting was they had a couple bad quarters because they had to restructure and stuff. But now they're really pushing we're going back to our release cycle of 3 to 4 new products a year, that they think that's going to rejuvenate the company. Can a company really do something like that if they've been down a path and they realize they've kind of like, hey, listen, we're not doing the product innovation like we should. We can course correct.
Yeah. Well, that is a great question. And in general, no. In general, companies do not go backwards once they've gone forwards. We try to get young. I mean, look at human beings, right? We try to get younger. I don't know about you, but maybe if I'm lucky, I can look younger in 6 months, but I'm not going to be younger in 6 months, right? And the only times I've seen companies successfully go backwards, there's 2 examples. The most obvious example is mergers and acquisitions, right?
Sure.
So if you see a company, they split, they take the growing part and they create a new company. They take the old part, they throw it into some sort of a private equity and flush the cash out of it.
Mm-hmm.
You see that kind of a situation. The new entity can move backwards, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then, you have the Apple situation where you're a PC company and then you launch a product that's just a killer home run product.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many companies that think they can do that.
Right.
But you can maybe only point to 3 or 4 times that it's really happened in the last, 2 or 3 decades. Where
Sure.
really
It was funny because I read over the summer, my beach read was Steve Jobs' biography. The Walter Isaacson who wrote that. And it was just interesting to me because, he's on such a pedestal with a lot of the business community, and he did a lot of interesting things and all that, but a lot of it was just, and I'm not going to say luck, but timing. When he grew up in Silicon Valley, being able to call up HP and get chips to make his stuff, and having having a technical expert in Wozniak as one of his best friends, and the VC money being there from Silicon Valley, just the timing is really what, which would make it, makes it much more difficult to think you can do that now.
Right. And timing is a critical element. And, one of the things usually, after I get, people ask me about, well, how do you prevent this from happening? Right. Well, you don't sort of, but you need
can't
to have
stop aging either, right?
Yeah, you can be aware and delay it maybe. Right. And one of the ways you delay that is to constantly question your assumptions. I mean, you think about, the only way humans can make decisions is to make, you have facts and you have assumptions, and you have to make, and there's a risk associated with that box of facts and assumptions.
Sure.
And you make a decision, and sometimes you get it right and sometimes you get it wrong.
Yeah.
But constantly revisit your assumptions. Like when you look and say, well, I have this great idea, and then you learn that, there are a lot of great ideas that we had in the 90s that, there just wasn't enough bandwidth in a 28.8 modem to execute, right?
Yeah,
and now
sure.
you don't even think about bandwidth now,
right? Yeah, bandwidth is inconsequential.
It's almost unlimited.
I remember I was having a talk with it was Joe Rundy. I don't know if I ever remember Dr. Joe Rundy from the photo industry, obviously one of the smartest people in the PR game back in the day, and we were talking about when he was doing with Kodak DNAI, he was showing me some digital camera prototype or something early on. I was getting it pre-disclosed. I felt like I was on one of the cool kids. I said, Joe, this is, why are you guys doing this? Because, people will shoot less film. And he goes, well, you've got to kill your children to move forward. So I think Kodak was trying to do that in some ways, and it may have been a timing or an execution or something, but they kind of had that attitude back then that we've got to do this because or else someone else is going to.
I think companies do, and we could talk about that for hours, but let me give you a more relevant example. So
Sure.
There's this tool called the Business Model Canvas,
Yep.
and it's pretty famous. Many people have heard of it, and when you look at that and you look at the margin and the material velocity of different services and products that a company provides, when you get an incompatibility in, let's say I want to innovate, my entire ship is moving in one direction and I want to innovate in a different direction, I can't move that ship. Right. And so, it gets out of sync. And what you're seeing is, there was a big rush for direct to consumer. Every brand was going to go direct to consumer. Right. And, Nike, just because of their scale, had some luck with it. But, it's really, really hard to do, because if you were to create a business unit that's a channel, it's going to have a different model. You can't optimize your operation for 2 different business models, right? So if you have a high velocity channel with 20 points of margin and a low velocity channel with 60 points of margin, you can't build a system that will optimize those 2 simultaneously.
Oh, come on. There's some Harvard MBA out there who thinks they can do it.
Yeah, well, maybe there's a pivot table in Excel that I that I missed.
I'm just saying, people are always trying it, as I guess my point. I mean, we see it all the time.
Yeah, people try it again, and that's why I point people back to, the business model canvas and, who's the customer. If you look at the business model canvas back to EMFL, that whole value proposition, customer segmentation portion of it is very compatible with the engineering phase, right? And then when you add the the go-to-market and the customer service and the logistics, that's when you get the marketing phase because you're scaling it widely, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then when you start getting into, you can't grow it anymore, then you start focusing on, the earnings and extracting money from earnings, right?
So there's a lot of talk or announcements of M&A right now, right? Mergers and acquisitions, people looking to buy each other out in the photo industry,
Sure.
right? I know of several deals that are in the process, several that have been announced. In terms of phase, when is a good time to look at that? Because you certainly don't want to look at lawyer phase.
No,
that seems to be where it happens.
Well, if you're buying, you might want to look at lawyer phase, right? But if you're trying to sell, I think you really need to look in the marketing phase. And look, I've followed this industry for 20 years, and I might be too honest for my own good right now. Mm-hmm. But most companies that start up in the photo output space think the market opportunity is bigger than it is. Right. And I maybe there's a killer technology or a killer app that's going to flip the market and it's going to suddenly explode. Mm-hmm. But it's been really predictable and flat for 20 years now, right? So what happens is when you have a play and you say, well, I have this really innovative idea that's going to flip the market, you sort of reach that point where you can't really push it any further. Maybe you successfully created the $50 or $100 million business that you wanted to create, but then you're up against the wall, right? At that point, you need to cooperate with other people and combine. And because what happens is a lot of them think, well, by the time they realize that they can't grow anymore, now your value is gone, right? Because when you value a company, you're looking at the future value of the company. Right. And if revenue's not growing, then you're looking and saying, okay, well, how much earnings is this thing throwing off for how long? And your valuation goes into the toilet, right? Right. And I maybe I'm not allowed to say that out loud, but I think it's pretty obvious that happens.
Well,
right?
We do allow the word toilet on this show. So.
Okay, good. But people will go into denial about that, right? Yeah. They think, I just need this one more feature, and then all of a sudden, everything will work well. Yeah. Right. But I think, what you're seeing now is a cycle in photo output that we've seen before, right? Mm-hmm. You sort of have, you have this, and it looks like a cycle, right? You have the company start, and then they consolidate, and then they decline, and then they regroup and they reorganize themselves. So I've watched the M&A. It's like two startups decide to get together and grow. Good, as long as they have a really good understanding of how big their market is and how much money they can produce. Sure. Right? Because a lot of these companies just can't produce enough revenue. To really it's expensive, right? Right. A lot of capital involved and so on, right? Mm-hmm.
Especially if you're actually physically making something, right? If you're an app company, it's a little different, but
labor's expensive. You can't get labor. Materials are expensive, et cetera, right? Mm-hmm. So it's tough.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
When it comes to influencer marketing, there's a podcast that covers it all that you will want to add to your playlist. The Influence Factor by the Influencer Marketing Factory. They talk about influencer marketing, social media, the creator economy, social commerce, and much, much more. They cover all aspects, including the creator economy, social commerce, the latest trends, the metaverse, TikTok trends, and that's just the beginning. The Influence Factor by the Influencer Marketing Factory. Add the podcast to your playlist right now.
It seems to me like different company, like in terms of the phases, the length of time can vary widely among all four of those
absolutely
things.
So let me give you an example of a really, really long life cycle.
Right.
Okay. Probably is Prudential Insurance, right? Okay. So Prudential Insurance is a company that is, there's probably going to be more people on the planet 5 years from now than there are today. Right. And those people are going to need life insurance. Right. So here's a company that just chugs along and just follows GDP and population growth and provides the service and has a very stable business model that's going to, so they could have a 200-300 year life cycle right?
Right.
As opposed to Yahoo that has like 4,
You're
So,
really dogging Yahoo. Do you have a bone to pick with them?
No, I don't have a bone to pick with them, but it's easy to pick on them because they're, in the history, right? I can pick on TikTok, or I could pick on
Hey,
Instagram,
I still get a few people with Yahoo Mail
But,
emails.
yeah,
So they're still out there.
Yeah. Well, that's one of those, your mama jokes. Your mom is so old, her email is mom@aol.com.
Yeah, there you go.
So,
exactly.
Anyways, but to your point, I mean, companies have different times in the life cycle, right? You might have a company. I mean, an example is IBM, right? So IBM went through a period of time when they had 15 or 20 consecutive quarters of year-over-year revenue decline. And I haven't looked at them in a while. And I know they split. And so they probably have a part that's growing and not growing, but this is a company that is in the finance phase for years, right? And the reason they're in finance phase for years is because they just had a tremendous number of assets. You looked at their balance sheet in 2000 and you could say, this company could probably live for 20 years, if they play their cards right, I mean, it really, it took Kodak 10 or 12 years to, when you look at kind of where it peaked to where, in 2012, right? So companies that have huge assets can live longer in the finance phase than companies that don't, right? So you see these companies that come in, so like Tesla's an example of, why are they doing so well right now? And I would say they're in the engineering phase, and electric car notwithstanding, that's all they've ever done, right? So they can optimize their entire supply chain. They don't have to worry about converting from gas and diesel and trying to leverage
legacy systems. They can
and completely new vendors and everything else like GM and Ford and
don't have to have a dealer network like traditional
exactly. So there are countless examples, and hopefully people, you start to look at companies and say, hey, yeah, that company's in the finance phase, right? So or in the engineering phase.
You recently posted about an example in the photo industry about a company that's 90 years old, that we both know, called Fujifilm. That you said is at the nexus of the engineering marketing phase. And they were specifically talking about the limited quantities of the brand new X106 rangefinder camera. Now, that's a 90-year-old company, that is somehow, walking that tightrope of staying there without transitioning. And not to say that they haven't done that and haven't gotten into the other phases or whatever, but I'm just curious what your insights were there.
Well, the other part of my post was that if you look at stock analysts looking at Fujifilm stock, they almost to a person will say the stock underperforms. Right. Almost to a person. Right.
Because they want that F phase.
You got it. Well, they want the money. I mean, they want to be able to buy it and buy low, sell high, right? And whatever, and they're not going to keep it forever anyway. So they have somebody who they pay to watch it, so they know right when to sell and right when to buy. So they're just looking for their little cycle. But Fujifilm has very long-term strategic plans, right? I mean, when you hear about Hoshin plans of 10, 15 years, they're very much on that. So the reason is they look and they say, okay, well, product, customer, technology, Keiretsu, right? Then they feel like that's their primary service, where a lot of companies feel like their shareholders are their primary service, right? And an example, I mean, the best example recently of this, which I posted on, was what happened with Xerox, right? So Xerox comes in, and Fujifilm had the Fuji Xerox relationship, and that was a very profitable division, and Xerox got to the point trying to compete at the higher end. They're saying, look, we need to. Fuji reached out, said, hey, we'll buy you, right? And then Carl Icahn comes in and says, oh, no, we want shareholder value. Right. We believe the shareholders are not going to get their value if Fujifilm buys them. Right. So we want shareholder. And what did he do? He fleeced the company and left. Right. And so now they're going through layoffs. It's in the paper here.
I've covered it in my newsletter. It's not great.
It's not good. Right. Because Carl Icahn is your example of a finance phase chairman, right? You can argue and say Elon Musk is the engineering phase, And, Twitter controversy with the media notwithstanding, he is an engineering phase, whether it's SpaceX or X or Tesla. Jeff Bezos, the marketing phase, right? Carl Icahn, the lawyer phase, or the finance phase, right? He is the master of the finance phase. And then the lawyer phase is, I say, any number of $1,200 an hour lawyers, right? that work on bankruptcies and everything else once that whole thing's dead, right? But you can see these patterns. Like if I see somebody like Carl Icahn is sniffing around, I would say, okay, how am I going to look at that? I can argue whether I like the company or not, or what, but you can sort of say, here's how I would make money if Carl Icahn was running the company.
Right.
Here's how I would make money if Elon Musk was running the company.
Right.
Because of where they are in that phase. Right. So I might really be in trouble now throwing those.
No, I don't. No, I think you raised a good point with that.
Look at the data, right? And
because
it's not just Xerox. He's done it with other companies. I mean, it's
right. That's the history, right? I mean, that's the thing. Is sort of, I think the business press likes it because it's controversial and he says crazy things, and he's a history of drama, right? He's a kind of a drama machine.
Well, in investment, the two most predictable phases in investment is when a company's growing and when a company's declining, right? So you look at say, okay, I'm going to buy a stock, but buy low, sell high, because I'm looking at the stock price and I know, revenue's growing, it's going to go up. And then the next phase is when people start shorting it to the ground, because once hedge funds get a hold of these companies that are in the finance phase and they start shorting them to the ground, they're going to force the stock to the ground. So you just keep betting lower.
Right.
And you short the stock. And that's how these, day traders that spend a far fewer hours a day working than I do, make millions of dollars, right?
So let's talk a little bit about Eastman Kodak's recent discussions regarding film production, right? Because I think that's sort of where they're getting back to their heritage. Where I'm not, and again, I don't want you to comment specifically on what your projections are for the company or whatever, but just sort of like the phase they're in, where they're kind of getting back to their roots, right? They're a chemical company doing chemical things, and they've recently announced in the quarterly call they are going to be the last manufacturer standing for film. And I just thought that was just an interesting commentary about, they're now making more money.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I would probably call it a pivot. Because if you looked at the post-bankruptcy days, there was a real call towards, hey, this is going to be a commercial printing company, and we're going to go out there and they've done amazing work in that space, building solutions. But printing is still sort of kind of in secular decline, with the exception of packaging, right? And there's nothing Kodak or anybody else can do that except be the best solution in that space, right? But it's not going to be the rocket growth. I mean, think about the customers for a second, right? If you're a print shop and you have an offset press, right? Fully amortized, 30 years old, and it's running, is a bank going to recapitalize me to buy a new digital press, right?
Right.
The economy's, it's tough. The recapitalization is kind of
yeah. I mean, it's funny you said, because I was visiting one of my industry friends, and they've got an old press like that, and they said, we bring work on it, and we just we're going to run that thing into the ground.
Yeah, you run it exactly. It's like it's like a 1986 Camry.
Right.
You can still going, right? but I think that the pivot to materials, it's being boosted by the repatriation of manufacturing that's been going on since COVID, right? Sure. I mean, that has been a real trend of the whole supply chain. Yeah, there were some problems and containers were in the wrong place, but I think countries and regions, started to realize they're vulnerable, right?
Right.
And so there is a real repatriation going on. And if you look at Eastman Business Park and you say, that's the largest industrial park in New York State, it's nearly fully intact still. It's completely self-sufficient. It has rail lines, it has power, it can operate completely self-sufficiently. And you're saying, hey, there's great schools here. So people are saying, hey, well, that's a really good place. And as a result, what you get is a combination of, being a landlord for new tech, building your own new tech and doing all the things that you've always done for, the last 100+ years. Right.
Yeah.
So it really is saying, hey, this is where the core is. And it's you see it in the results. I mean, that's as far as I can go.
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying it's public announcements and
public information. If anybody wants to know what's driving, so if I'm sitting there and I'm looking at this company, I'm saying, yeah, the revenue growth wasn't quite there, but the pivot was for earnings, and the earnings are there. Right. And now flowing cash, reinvesting in capital, attracting new customers into Eastman Business Park because it's here and they need a place where they can plug in. It's going to be an interesting story over the next 3 to 5 years. I can tell you.
Yeah, I think they've definitely, kind of gotten off the, this is a case study of how a company's destroyed their heritage and whatever. And I think now it's a much more positive story, like you said. And now they can, because they have this capability, they're actually reinventing in filmmaking equipment, right? Because they now have the cash to reinvest. And film is, it's kind of a niche product right now. It's certainly not going to be the future of the company, but it's still a popular thing, and they can be the last people on the planet making it.
Yeah. And, just on the last manufacturer standing comment, I know that, if you read, and I read all the blogs, right, because I'm interested in the industry, and I think, there's always that question, well, so-and-so is making film. What does that mean to being the last manufacturer standing in film? And, the answer is it doesn't matter. Right. The last manufacturer standing in film is a battle cry. It's a battle cry for the employees. It's a battle cry for the community, for the customers. If there is ever a last roll of film made, or, a last PCB board mask or something made, it's going to be made by Kodak. Right. And that's, that's the part of it that sort of says, okay, if you're a chemist and you're at Purdue or you're at Cornell and you say, hey, should I go to work for Kodak? Yeah, you probably should, because it's going to be a great place to be. So, anyways, enough on that topic, I guess. Right. So,
no, I didn't know. I think that's a great place to kind of bring our conversation to a conclusion, sort of on the positive side, that there is a great future for this kind of stuff. If you're actually making stuff, if you're at that nexus of engineering and marketing, you can certainly have a successful business. Just keep those darn accountants and those darn lawyers out of it.
Well, I mean, make sure your shareholders are committed to your strategy, right? I mean, that really, you can talk about the analysts or some guy trying to short the stock, on Reddit or something like that, right? But that they don't matter. What really matters is making sure that you're aligned with your shareholders, right? And just look at who the shareholders are, and you'll say, hey, that's pretty impressive list of people, right?
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, Ben. Where can people go to see more of your musings?
Oh, my musings. The best place to see my musings, are LinkedIn, right? I hate to shout out to Microsoft, but I'm not like a big build a web page kind of a guy. I go on to for the general community, I tend to share, a few thoughts a week on LinkedIn, and then, for my friends, Facebook or, stuff like that. But, old school, right? I haven't haven't graduated to the next thing yet. Right. So not doing TikTok videos. I guess I gotta learn how to do that.
Well, I think the world is thankful for that. Well, thank you, Ben. Great talking to you again. Take care. Hope to see you next time I'm in or near Rochester. Take care.
Yes, sir. See ya.
Thank you for listening to the Dead Pixel Society podcast. Read more great stories and sign up for the newsletter at www.thedeadpixelssociety.com.